Hi, my name is David Ferrazzoli, and I'm going to be pitching to you the courtroom drama The Birthday Verdict. Now, this movie is based off the American Mock Trial Association case for this year. It was set around a drunk driving accident and the prosecution of the driver. This case is important to me as I feel drunk driving is a very important social issue that it tends to be overly demonized. We don't see the other side of the story. We don't see the humanization of the driver. We just see the fact that they were drunk or not. And the reason for this movie being a courtroom drama is to show this aspect. The logistics of law tend to make things black and white, when outside the courtroom it's not black and white. There are situations involved, there are emotions, and this movie is going to show both the courtroom side, the law aspect, and the actual night in question, the emotional, the truth part. There are multiple characters in this story, but everything centers around the central character, Mr. Dawson, Mr. Daniel Dawson. He is a college student, senior year of college, applying to law school, and he was celebrating his friend Vanessa Sullivan's birthday that night, and he drank too much, was driving Vanessa Sullivan and another person home that night, Taylor Hobson, and got into a car accident. There are several other characters involved. There's Officer Ryan Foster. He's the first patrol officer on the scene. There's Patricia Lawrence, who was the waiter that night, actually served the drinks to Mr. Dawson. Taylor Hobson, as I mentioned before, is a major character. She's emotionally traumatized from the crash. She survived and testifies against Dawson later in the movie. There's London Bennett, who saw the actual car accident occur. She's an old woman. She's lived by the site of the crash for many years. There's the bartender, Mr. Jordan James, who is friends with Mr. Dawson, but also was the bartender that night and prepared all the drinks. Now, the story itself begins in the courtroom. The opening statements of the attorneys are finishing up. A lot of everything focuses on Mr. Dawson, how he's kind of zoned out. He knows what's going on, but is still kind of wrapped up in the emotions of everything. And he begins to daydream and recall the events of that night. You see him leaving a job interview. He goes to the bar kind of early. He's going to wait for them. And he's talking to Jordan James, the bartender, who is his friend. And he takes his first shot. This is kind of an important point to focus on, as it's the first shot of many that he had that night. Now, everything cuts back to the courtroom, as it does many, many times in this movie. The courtroom kind of adds the more narrative aspect while we see the actual events unfold. The first witness called is Officer Ryan Foster. He's your stereotypical looking police officer. He recalls having seen Dawson drive by earlier that night, but he didn't pull him over because the car that he was driving in was Vanessa Sullivan's, and Vanessa Sullivan's the daughter of the prosecuting attorney of that county, and he didn't want to deal with all the politics. It was raining that night, so he thought maybe the car was just having problems with the rain. Unfortunately, he would later receive a call that this car had gotten into a car accident. He responded to the call, went to the scene of the car accident, and ran field sobriety tests on Dawson. But he and another officer couldn't decide whether Dawson had been injured and was able to perform the test, whether the rain was affecting him, or whether he was truly drunk. The next witness called is Patricia Lawrence, the waiter. She recalls serving Dawson drinks and recalls him acting very drunk that night, stealing drinks from other people, and just generally drinking a lot. The final witness called on the prosecution side is Taylor Hobson. She is still very emotionally traumatized by this event. When she gets to the stand, she speaks very timidly and describes what happened. She describes her interactions with Danny, the fact that all three of them were drinking. She wasn't sure anybody should get in the car, but she got in anyways. And as she gets to describing the car accident, she breaks down on the stand. She can't actually describe it, but we see what happens anyways, and see every vivid detail, see the car spin out, and see the car actually physically crash. The court goes to recess, a convenient time for an Act 4 break, and then as it comes back, the defense is given the opportunity to defend itself. They call London Bennett to the stand. She testifies to the rainy conditions that night and testifies to her view of the accident, living right by the street. And she describes how she ran down, checked on the passengers to make sure they were okay, saw that they weren't, called 911, and talked to the officers and described everything that she had seen. The next witness called is Jordan James, the bartender. He describes the bar's policy on serving drinks, how they don't serve designated drivers, how if somebody looks too drunk, they take away the keys, and if somebody can't get home, they make sure to call a cab. And then he describes how his friendship with Dawson and how he had seen Dawson drunk many times, and that night, even though the bar was busy, Dawson did not seem drunk, and James thought that Dawson was safe to drive. Now, all this doesn't seem to fit well with the jury, as it looks very biased as it is. So the final witness called is Mr. Dawson. He is obviously very nervous. He is on trial. His hands are shaking. He tries to explain his story, but stumbles over everything, doesn't explain things well. But fortunately, we see what's actually happening. We see the other events described by Lawrence, by Hobson, happening, but we see the other side of the story. We see how Dawson reacted to things. We see that Dawson stopped drinking after a certain point, started drinking soda in order to get himself more concentrated on the drive. Finally, Dawson finishes his testimony. He leaves, the jury goes and deliberates, and as they come back out, everything focuses on Dawson. He closes his eyes, waits for the verdict, and then he receives it. Guilty. The judge gives him his sentence. The bailiff is ordered to take him away. In one final moment, Dawson makes eye contact and tries to ask forgiveness with Hobson. Taylor Hobson, still emotional, denies him that sympathy. Now, and that would be the end of the movie. Now, this movie would find an ideal market at both A&E and Lifetime. The channels tend to display more social issues, such as drunk driving, and as this is a kind of a more of an educational film rather than meant for its entertainment value, it would go perfect on these networks. In terms of casting, it's not important to get any particular star per se for any role, but it's important to get people who play the certain parts. It's important to get somebody who can act traumatized as Taylor Hobson. It's important to get somebody who looks around the college age for Mr. Dawson. Overall, this movie is supposed to provide an educational look outside of the black and white spectrum of things, but also not sacrifice the entertainment value of what would be liked in a movie. Alright, thank you.